Looks like we're a go. So good morning, everyone. Today, welcome to Bridges to Better Business. So this is the Business Center's full month program of development and information. So my name's Angie. I'm the program coordinator for the Business Center Guelph-Wellington. And today we're joined with Christie Ferguson from One Stop HR Solution. So I will pass this over to Christie and we can get going. As normally, if you have any questions, do put them in the chat. I will be monitoring the Facebook chat as well so that we can get those for you. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Angela. I am just going to share my screen. There we go. So you should see my PowerPoint presentation up and running. So again, thank you for the intro there. I'm from a company called One Stop HR and involved in all kinds of HR consulting, from how do we hire people, how do we recruit people, right through to documentation on disciplinary issues, policies, all kinds of great stuff. So this is great to be able to chat with you today about some of the red flags that we tend to see as HR consultants in businesses, in Ontario businesses, and really important to be aware of these, especially if you're looking at building a business, starting a business. Maybe you've already got a business and you're looking to grow it a little bit. And as soon as you hire that first employee, whammo, there's a whole bunch of stuff you've got to do on the HR side. So I'm going to talk a little bit about, let me go to my next slide here, about the HR role and how it's kind of evolved, and the importance for businesses to really set that foundation, that solid set of HR practices as you're looking to start a business and hire those employees. Then we'll look at those common red flags that we tend to see as HR consultants. And my goal here is to leave you with those thoughts of things you've got to be aware of, such that when you're looking to start that business, as you're growing that business, when you're looking to start hiring, or maybe you're already there, you can understand those things that we really need to make sure are addressed so that we minimize any repercussions in terms of Ministry of Labor, etc., to knock on your door. COVID-19, has there been an impact on HR? Absolutely. Hasn't there been an impact on everyone with COVID-19 and this pandemic? So just a little bit of a chat there. I know there's probably some questions around mandatory vaccine policies, so I'll touch on that briefly. And as we go through this, if I can ask you to participate, and as Angela said, if you've got any questions, feel free to take yourself off mute or use the chat program, and I'm happy to answer them as well. So let's get started here. So HR, human resources, when we first look at when human resources really came about, really it was just sort of that, oh, what do we do with this and part of our business? Let's just throw it over to human resources. So lots of admin related activities, calling and booking appointments for interviews, lots of administrative type roles for human resources. But what we've seen over the last number of years is that HR is really growing in terms of importance to a business. And not only just the importance to a business in a general sense, more so as a strategic partner. And definitely a piece that every business should have as part of their business and as growing their business. Do you need to hire an HR body for your business as soon as you hire that first employee? No, you don't need a full-time HR person. You may not even need a part-time HR person. You may just need advice for the first little while as you get going and building that platform, or before you even hire that employee. But as you continue to look forward, really having HR in your corner as a strategic business partner is really, really important. I teach at Conestoga College as well as running this business, and I've noticed over the past number of years that a lot of the courses are really focusing on being strategic and how HR is and needs to play that strategic role. So it's been a very interesting transition. So, the role of HR, you could be involved in payroll in HR, policy generation, health and safety, recruitment and selection, onboarding, documentation. Man, oh man, is this ever a hot item right here, documentation. And I like to joke that documentation is my middle name because without it, we can't prove that something happened. So, documentation, absolutely key. Sorry, a little passionate about that one. And then there's obviously some general administration as well. So I've put this little note down here. The value of HR is often something businesses don't tend to realize until they get themselves into hot water, then quickly scramble to get HR in place. So this is when I get calls. Most often, if I were to look at all the phone calls that I would get in terms of questions on HR, this is the biggest scenario where a business has a problem. Maybe they've got an employee that's claiming harassment, and they don't have any policies in place, or they need policies put in place. That's quite often when I get phone calls. So what we like to see is we build that foundation first, it's to help protect our businesses, so that when something does come up, it's not as much of a panic or a big issue for an employer. I shouldn't say big issue. It's not, it's more easily supported. So let's keep going. In our practice, we complete HR audits. And the HR audit is, when somebody's got a business that's maybe already established and they haven't had HR in place and they've kind of been doing things hit and miss, which is very, very common. We'll come in, we'll do an HR audit, and we'll look at everything that they've got in place, anything from policies right through to exits, employee terminations. And we'll take a peek at what they may be missing. And then we'll create a report that shows them what those red flags may be in their business. And when I say red flags, really what I'm talking about are the gaps that businesses have in terms of their HR that could lead to an HR tribunal situation where someone is claiming harassment and there hasn't been a policy that's been put in place or a process that's been followed, and all of a sudden a company is looking at a lawsuit or being brought forward to an HR tribunal. So these are types of things we want to try and avoid. Ministry of Labor can come in, and they can come in at any time whatsoever, but they can also have hefty fines if you don't have certain things in place. So, as I've mentioned, really important that we get that foundation built, and then we can build on it as you add more employees to your business. Doesn't mean, as I mentioned, you have to have an full-time HR person in place. You could have a consultant in place, or at least someone that you can reach out to for assistance. And I've put this at the bottom here as well. Remember the signs, call us before you dig. At the back of our property, we've got Enbridge pipelines, and we definitely cannot dig before calling Enbridge pipelines. But same kind of applies for HR. Before you start adding those employees, or if you already have, make sure that you call or that you have some kind of an HR platform put in place to help support you. I think I've driven that point home. I'll move on. So, question back to you, and I'd really like you to participate here if you can. Whoops, what happened there? I'm going to move that over there. There we go. So let's assume that you are a certified HR professional who does those audits that I just talked about, where you go in, take a look at a business, figure out what the gaps are in terms of HR practices. What do you think might be some of the most common problem areas for businesses in terms of things that might be lacking in their HR? See if you can come up with a couple. And again, feel free to take yourself off mute or put it in a chat program in the chat. If you're not comfortable coming forward, you don't have ideas, we'll move on and I'll come up with those. But Angela, have you got something? Oops, you're on mute there, but I do see the chat.
Hi, Christy. I see in one of the chats it said job contract with expectations.
Oh man, that's a big one. Yes, very, very common where employers don't have an employment agreement put in place or a contract for contract employees as well. Absolutely. Good. Anything else?
It seems pretty quiet.
Okay, all right, no problem. So let's keep going and we'll talk about the areas that I have listed as my red flags or those high ticket items in terms of things that quite often we see when we do these HR audits. Number one, recruitment and selection. A lot of businesses don't realize that you really should have a documented process. And with that documented process, it would be here's how we recruit and hire for our people. Interview questions, having interview questions that are documented with a scoring method. And those interview questions, we use those same ones for every person that we put through an interview for that particular position. So we don't switch up those questions from person to person. We have a standard process. And as part of that, the questions that we are asking are not discriminatory. So, meaning that, those questions don't say things like, how old are you? Are you planning to start a family? How many kids do you have? Are your kids in daycare? So, those are types of things we cannot ask. And so, we have to be really careful and they have to be documented, or they should be documented. Likewise, a reference check form and a permission form. So standard reference check questions that we would ask, permission that we would ask from the candidate first in order to check those references. Why do we do this? Really important because if we have someone that goes through the interview process, and quite often these are disgruntled people that have gone through the process and didn't get hired, and they then come back to say, I was discriminated against as part of the recruiting, and that's why they didn't hire me. They discriminated against me because of my religion, because of my insert, whatever it might be, my age. How are you going to prove that that didn't happen? That's why we relied back on the process and the documentation and the notes that we took. So there's so much more I could talk about on this particular topic, but just want to drive home the point that this is an area a lot of companies don't tend to think of, and a really important one to make sure is documented. The scoring is in there on your interview questions so that you take the personal bias out and you have an actual dedicated way to score score answers on the interview questions such that if I handed it to Paul or to Sue, they would come up with the same score on that interview candidate based on that scoring method. Okay, and that legend in order to score. Educated interviews is a point here too, because if someone isn't educated in what they can and cannot ask in an interview, that person is definitely a liability for the business. Again, I've been brought into situations where there's a team lead who's been put in to interview because maybe the supervisor's away, or they're doing it just to help them grow, which is fantastic, and experience new things. But that individual maybe didn't know the things that you can and cannot ask, and all of a sudden the company is brought forward, lawyers knocking on their doorstep, or something similar, and that's something we really want to avoid. So really important to document our process and have a solid process in place. I've also noted here the onboarding process is important as well. Make sure we document that. We've got checklists in place in terms of what happens on their first day, what happens in their first week, mandatory training, all of that is checked off as it happens. We'll talk a little bit more about mandatory training later. Again, if you've got questions, feel free to interrupt at any time whatsoever. Number two, in terms of another red flag that we often see as HR consultants, performance management. That process of managing the difficult employee or the employee who's just not meeting expectations of the job. Really, really important to have a disciplinary process put in place and a documented performance review process and a process for addressing those performance issues, which may start off as just minutes of a meeting that we're documenting. Then it may progress to a more formal method, such that we're talking about those things that need to be improved and what will happen if they're not improved. But really important to have something put in place. And I've put this down here. Can a performance review be something that might come back to haunt an employer? And I'll answer this for you. Absolutely. So we can have a beautiful performance review form that is great in terms of addressing any kinds of things that are going well in terms of the performance of that employee, and then noting all those things that maybe they need to pick up their socks on and have examples to demonstrate that. We can have beautiful review forms and processes in place. However, if we have a manager, let's say, that feels badly at marking people down as not performing, so they want to just kind of rate everybody high in terms of how they did on their performance. Or maybe we're going to use that performance review, we're saving up all these things that employee did wrong and we're going to blast them in this performance review. Both of those, not good. And those are just two examples. Where this can really come back to haunt you is, let's say we gave Joe a glowing performance review when really Joe was the average performer. We've been kind of watching Joe, and we decide a month later or so to terminate Joe. Joe's not very happy about being terminated. He was terminated without cause, which is what we can do. But now all of a sudden, because Joe's not happy, he starts going back. What kind of documentation do I have? Well, I have a performance review that was glowing and it was only a month ago, and now I'm terminated. Even though it was without cause, that can come back to haunt an employer. So it can be used in a court, it could be used in a tribunal to help support maybe a wrongful dismissal or other avenues. So we want to make sure that our process, that our performance reviews are accurate and we are applying them properly. So quite often when we speak of performance reviews, you'll hear me also say it's really important for our managers to be trained on how to use those forms. We may pay a consultant to come in and make these beautiful forms, and we introduce them and say, hey, we've got this process. But if we don't train our managers on being able to actually execute those and execute them properly, then we're doing a disservice. And again, it could become a liability. Got to be careful. Health and safety, another big one. Quite often we will come into a business that's maybe been established for quite a while and they have no health and safety policies in place, or maybe they're out of date. Maybe it's a new business that's starting and they don't realize they have to have certain policies in place as of that day one when that employee starts. So health and safety, another big area to look at. First aid kits, important, and there's different recommendations, or not recommendations, actual requirements in terms of the type of first aid kit, the contents, etc. depending on the size of your organization, you may need committees or a committee. There may be minutes that are required. And there's also WSIB in the management of that program as well. Another red flag. Mandatory training. So question back to you if anyone's comfortable participating. Outside of specific industries that may have other required training like fall arrest, things like that, what would be the normal required training for provincially regulated businesses in Ontario that that we are required as soon as we have that first employee to make sure that they're trained in? Anyone name one or two of those? Looking for 4. I'll give you a second.
I was gonna say I could probably name almost all of them, but then I also wrote policies and procedure manuals for.
Okay. What have you got, Angela?
So mandatory training in a workplace. You have to do WMIS, depending. Somebody wrote WMIS and rights of the employees. Violence in the workplace. If you are doing any kind of heights, you have to do the heights training in the workplace. You have to do workplace. There's a whole bunch of health and violence and mandatory ones that we ended up that a lot of companies can find a secondary source to do them online. They're really easy.
Right.
But, yeah.
Good. Okay. Excellent. So definitely those are some of the ones I was looking for. So the 4 most common ones that will apply to basically every business, no matter what. And again, we can get more specific with the training at heights and what have you, based on the industry that you're in. But the 4 most common are the AODA. So that's that Accessibilities Act and training, and so that we know how to address people with disabilities and etc. That's what that one's all about. There's the violence one that Angela mentioned, and harassment. So it's a 2 pieces that are needed there. WMIS was mentioned, health and safety. So those are the most common ones, and really important that we have a record of training all those employees as well. We keep that and we monitor, and there are times when we need to redo that training. And if we notice that there's maybe some complaints coming forward, we may need to retrain everyone again. So those are types of things that definitely employers can get caught on if they don't have that training in place. This again as a minimum. And Angela mentioned there are resources online. Be careful because some of these get outdated pretty quickly, and especially around the violence and harassment. We'll train that one ourselves because there's a lot of information out there that doesn't have the updated information to it. And if you're ever in a situation where an employee does come forward with one of those things and that wasn't part of the training, it could be a bit of an issue for you. So be careful, but certainly there's lots of different resources that you can use, and I can certainly help you if you have these questions and give you some links there. All right, next one, documentation. You knew it was going to hit my list, right? Because I said it's my middle name. Huge, 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 huge. So the reason is, if you don't have it, you can't prove that it happened. It's very difficult to prove that it happened. So document, 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 document. And let's look at the types of documentation. We've got disciplinary. And when we think of documentation, quite often that's the one that everybody starts to think about is, okay, disciplinary, right? Okay, we can write somebody up and we're good. So yeah, documentation of disciplinary issues, definitely really important. We want to make sure that, let me rephrase this. If this documentation was brought forward as part of a case against the employer on disciplinary action, what the judge likes to see is that there was a progression. So, well, we don't like to see a progression. We hopefully address it in the first time we have an issue. But if it's if it's escalated, we like to see that there's been a progression in terms of the documentation and the disciplinary side of it, or the consequences to continuing that behavior that's inappropriate. So one, it's starting off making sure we're addressing that behavior. And then let's say that behavior continues, then it's stepping it up a bit. Okay, this has happened again. Now we are also showing them, sorry, let me step back, and also showing them how they need to improve. Now we've stepped it up and said it's happened again. Obviously, that's not working. Here are some other ways we're going to help you to improve. But now here's some consequences if this happens. Then it happens again. Those consequences are now increased. Maybe it could lead to termination, could lead to, a suspension. But we're showing that there's been a pathway, and we've tried to address the issue here when it didn't improve, and we've tried to give them ideas on how they can improve and support them. Now we've moved this up. Well, here's what else we're going to be needing to put in place here, and here's what might happen. Happens again. Well, look, here's now what's happened. You're getting a suspension. So we've showed steps of progression, and we can actively then show by our documentation that this person has not improved and it's continued to happen. That's what a judge likes to see in order to help support. Okay, that's what a lawyer likes to see in order to help support. Terminations, there can definitely be issues with documentation when it comes to termination. Sometimes people produce on their own a termination letter, and that letter is not worded properly. Maybe it's a without cause termination, but they start putting all kinds of details on why that person's being terminated in the letter. We want to stay away from that. Without cause, we want to be very careful in what we say in a meeting as well, and what we don't say in a meeting. And same with a with cause termination. We've got to be very careful. And putting a manager in that situation where they are terminating, they must know what they can and cannot say, because it's when that employee takes issue and they are able to take that piece of paper, that termination letter, or to note what was said during that meeting and then take it to their lawyer, who can then run with it. That's where it becomes a problem. So be very, very careful on the termination side as well. I often recommend having a lawyer draw up a letter. We certainly can draw them up as well. And this one, I'm a little bit more comfortable in terms of, it not going right through a lawyer unless it is a particularly difficult situation. We've seen enough terminations that we know what needs to be included and what's not to be included in termination letters. But when there are difficult situations involved, that's when we'll say, no, we need to have this reviewed by a lawyer to help you. Documentation, policies, and practices, another area that's really important. There are certain policies and practices that you have to have in place for your business. And if you don't have them in place, it can be a problem for your business. So the ministry could come in, ask to see your policies on A, B, and C. And if they're not there, some can be nice and say, well, they need to be there, and I'll give you 2 weeks to have them put in place. And some may not be as nice and say, you know what, this isn't good enough. You need to have this in place, and give you a fine. So really important that we have the required policies in place. And I like to see those in place before we have our employees. But if you've got employees, you don't have it in place, which we receive calls on all the time, then no time is better than the present. So jump on them. The other piece here is also to get them signed off by the employee. That's quite often a piece that's missing as well. And then we're able to show if we've got a problem, employee is not following the process or procedure, we're able to then prove, if we need to, listen, the employee saw the policy, they signed off on the policy, and that will help support us if there's a reason for terminating, etc. Sometimes we have these policies. I'm going through a situation right now with a client where they've got beautiful policies in place, but they're not followed consistently or they're not enforced. And that also creates a problem because if somebody is able to get away with it and somebody else is not able to get away with it, then there's definitely going to be issues there. And it's harder to then rein people back in and make them be consistent and follow policy after that point. So be aware, very important to have that in place as well. Employment agreements, we mentioned earlier, this was one of the comments earlier. I will still run into employers that have verbal agreements, and verbal agreements still stand, but like I mentioned with documentation, if you can't rely on something to be able to demonstrate where your position is at in terms of a verbal agreement, then it becomes very difficult. It's more so a he said, she said situation. And that's something that lawyers have a very difficult time defending. So it's nice if we have that documentation. We have an employment agreement in place. That employment agreement was created by a lawyer and it so legally produced. It's up to date. It's been reviewed annually because things change. Lawyers like to tweak their wording because of what's happening in the courts, in the tribunals. And it may be that something was brought forward and being challenged as part of an agreement, and they want to make sure that they alter agreements going forward because of that wording, and it just wasn't strong enough. So important to make sure that that's created by a lawyer and that it's reviewed annually. You'll see on here I've got non-competition and non-solicitation and confidentiality agreements. Some of these are hard to enforce. Non-compete is really hard to enforce. It's kind of used more like a scare tactic. We don't want you leaving our company, setting up shop and competing directly against us. Again, little hard to enforce, but always good to have an agreement in place. Non-solicitation, if you do leave, you can't bring a whole bunch of our employees with you. Confidentiality agreements, whatever you've learned about our business and our practices, you can't go and share that with our competitors or what have you. So again, those are also important agreements to look at as well and have legally drawn up. I put a little note in here. Quite often I'll hear that people have found something online and that's what they're using. Be really careful because some of that won't apply to your business. It could be outdated and get you in a lot of hot water. Really important also to let people that you are giving an offer to make sure they have time to review the offer. So give them a few business days so that they could take it to a lawyer if they want to, and also make sure that if they are signing that agreement, that it's done at least 24 hours before they start work. Otherwise, it could be deemed as non-enforceable. Job descriptions, again, another thing we like to see documented, something again we can fall back on if we need to in terms of performance issues, or even in the future if we are looking at a termination or a promotion, all kinds of things. So goal achievement as well helps us kind of look to where we want to grow in terms of what maybe this job description might be, and for promotions and etc. So job description's important. Is it the top of my list? No, it's not, but it's on my list. Onboarding checklists or checklists for what needs to go in the file, or termination checklists, exit checklists, all of these things also important as well. And it kind of keeps us on track such that we will not miss certain things that might be really, really important. Employee turnover, really important to kind of keep an eye on what our turnover rates are. If it's going up, we want to dive into why that is. Could be a culture issue, could be a management issue, could be lots of different things. So keep an eye on turnover. make sure that you address it and keep on top of it. Lots more that we could talk about here. And I'm just kind of looking at my slides and how many I've got left here. So I want to kind of jump into the next one and go from there. But definitely those would be the most common HR red flags that we would see with a business. So hopefully by sharing that, it gives you an idea of those things that you want to make sure you have in place if you don't already and you already have employees, or have in place such that you've got that foundation, and then you're able to build on that as you add more employees into your business. So now we have the pandemic. We have COVID-19 that enters the scene here. What is the impact on HR, and what happened? Well, our employers were definitely scrambling. What do? We couldn't find information. So how is it that we are supposed to react to this as employers? What are we supposed to do? And information was inconsistent. And for HR, for a lot of us, it was the first time going through something like this, obviously, and all new territory. So there were all kinds of gaps, all kinds of red flags here. And what kinds of new gaps or challenges hit our businesses and specifically fell to HR? Let's kind of keep going here. Well, mandatory requirements. What are the new mandatory requirements now for COVID-19? Well, we needed to come up with a business response in how we're going to actually deal with this in our workplace. There were posters. We had to put up posters. We had to train our employees on how to sanitize their hands, or what our expectations were in terms of minimizing the spread of it within the organization, within the company, within the office. Masks, sanitizer, protocols for this and for that, and making sure we've got some kind of a screening mechanism in place. All of those things were requirements, and certainly on the HR side, we were scrambling, employers were scrambling. Thank goodness we seem to have a lot of that in place now, because we've been dealing with this for quite a while. Hopefully not much longer, but we can always hope. PPE, people were scrambling as well, and making sure that they were trying to have that in place for their employees. So this continues to be requirements. There continue to be mandatory requirements within our businesses on how we're dealing with this, and making sure that we are minimizing the spread. Layoffs, this was another big thing as well with our businesses that were going through financial concerns and issues. They had to start laying people off. And then there was a concern, oh goodness, I'm going to have to recall them at some point, or I'll have to terminate them. But the government came in and put an infectious disease leave in place, and then has continued to extend that, which kind of took the burden. Well, it didn't kind of, it took the burden off of employers to have to be involved in a recall situation at 13 weeks or 35 weeks. And right now it's just been extended to January 1, 2022. There's a lot more on this, but I'm going to kind of keep going. And there's a link here as well if you wanted more information on the slides. And then I've got some links at the end as well. But this does keep getting extended, which has been able to help employers such that they're not in a situation to have to terminate their employees at the end of that 13 weeks if they can't bring them back on, or the 35 weeks, depending on their situation, because that could be quite the expense as well. Remote workers, if people were able to work from home, they were transitioned to be able to work from home in order for that business to stay in business. But then some people didn't have adequate internet. Some people didn't have desks at home. Some of our clients didn't have laptops for their employees to be able to take home. So that created all kinds of issues. And then policies around working from home. What do those policies look like? The business also needed technology in order to support people working from home. That was another issue. HR, we revamped some of our processes, our terminations too. Some of them had to be virtual, which is not very nice, but in a situation that we were in, we had to go through that process. We had to also think about expenses. So are we going to compensate people for having internet at home and using their internet for work purposes? What about phone? Lots of different things were impacted. Leadership, our managers, our supervisors were struggling with how they were going to lead their team remotely because many have never done that before. So there's been lots of coaching, and there's still lots of coaching on that as well in terms of what our best practices and how to do that. Performance reviews. A lot of my clients, their supervisors, their managers are saying, well, how can I do a performance review when I don't even see what they're doing? So, good question. And hence why we build other things in place in order for them to be able to monitor performance, not just for the performance review form that needs to be filled out, but on an ongoing basis, being able to monitor performance. And that was a big fear when we send people to work from home. How do we know they're working? How do we know that's what they're doing? So there's things we can put in place to help with that. Health and safety, when we've got people that are working at desks at home, are they ergonomically correct? This seems to be an issue normally we have to be really, really worried about and making sure that we are complying with regulations. Seems to be this one there's been a little bit more leeway right now, but certainly something we want to, as a business, be aware of because we don't want there to be injuries where it's going to impact their work as well. HR touch points, it's not easy for someone to wander into HR's office if they're working remotely. So a lot of our businesses, we've advised them to have little HR check-ins such that we're at least touching base with employees and making sure everything's still good. And then we had to kind of figure out what we do in other types of HR related situations when our people are working remotely. Policies, lots of changes in policies with sick days or infectious disease leave, new benefits coming out. Those all were things that we needed to look at as well. And then policies on symptom management. We had to develop those, and some are still developing those. This is a big one. Mental health was and is a big one, where sometimes it's our employees are worrying about their job. They're worrying if their company's going to be in business next week, next month, and sometimes they're overworked. Maybe some employees have been let go or they're off on leaves and they're getting the brunt of their work. So their mental health is suffering, they're getting sick, etc. So really important to be able to touch base, to share resources, if there's an EAP program in place that they have access to that, but making sure they know there's help and places to turn to has been important and is still quite important. Recruiting, another area. Companies didn't know if they should recruit or not. If they do bring people in and their business suffers, they're going to have to let them go. So that's also an area where people were struggling, and now we're really struggling to find employees. General labor is a huge issue right now, trying to find people to come in to work, and sometimes that's because there are benefits out there that they can take advantage of and not come into work. So lots of struggles around recruitment as well. How do we engage our team? How do we do team building events? Excuse me, to promote team. Maybe we used to do lots of lunches or team building activities, and we can't have people together in the office, or everybody's working remotely. But what I've seen has been pretty interesting over the last number of months, where we've come up with some really cool ideas to help engage people and still be able to do it remotely. I've got clients that have come up with some really neat things as well. Again, just for fun and to, add that fun back into the work environment. Just because we're working remotely doesn't mean that we can't still have those things in place. We just have to be a little bit more creative. What's the future of work? What's it going to look like because of all that's happened? So COVID-19 definitely has changed the way we work. I certainly have clients that are selling their large office space and either downsizing to a smaller one where they're going to hotel desks. People kind of come in, book a desk to work at certain days of the week. Maybe they're moving all remotely and able to, you know, conduct their work that way as well. I have employers that absolutely would not ever have anyone working from home who now have people working from home and are comfortable with that. So it's all about how it's going to work for your business, if it will work for your business, and setting in those policies and practices around that. I see this is very much going to be a desire of the workplace, of the workforce, sorry, post COVID, post pandemic. It's going to be expected if the position could be done remotely, that there'll be an opportunity to work from home, if not all the time, some of the time. Vaccine policies, I put down here, vaccine policies, ... Hot topic, huge hot topic. Lots of questions around this topic. My general quick advice is, if you wish to put one in place at your workplace, I would advise you to have it legally reviewed. So whether we create it for you, whether you have it created by a lawyer, definitely make sure it is reviewed legally. And it's definitely a very hot topic right now. Lots of phone calls on this topic. My summary: importance that HR is in place at your business, whether it's someone there that's there full-time or part-time, or you've got a consultant in place. You really want to make sure you've got access to HR. And definitely, if anything was a great example to demonstrate the importance of HR, COVID-19 was definitely a great example, and hence why I just went through that in the last few slides. You want to have HR as a foundation in your business. As you grow your business, HR can continue to grow with your business to support you. Definitely also want to monitor your external environment, your internal environment as a business, so that you can adapt and remain competitive and strategic. HR is the same way. We have to do the same and advise you of when changes need to be made in order to help protect your business. Lots of talking from my end. If you're still awake, I thank you. Hopefully you're still awake. I thank you for going through this, Angela, for supporting this. I'll hand it back over to you, Angela.
Not a problem. That was great. So much information. Also, I do totally agree with the whole, like, keeping your pulse on what's going on. As someone who has written many policies and procedures and then rewrote them 2 years later and then rewrote them 2 years after that.
Yes, all the time.
That's one of those big things that I even tell our new startup businesses is start thinking about your policies and procedures before you even launch, because once you need them, the amount of time putting into them is so much sometimes. That's versus right. If you just kind of build them as you're going.
That's right.
So
very key.
No, totally great. So for those who are watching on Facebook, I don't have any current questions in our chats anywhere, but if you're watching and would like to connect with Christie or have any questions, do feel free to send me an email. It's success@guelphbusiness.com, or you can message me on any of our social platforms. I'm available. I'll be answering your questions, and I could pass you through and connect you directly with Christie if you have anything that we can't help you with directly at the business center. Aside from that, I would love to thank Christie for joining us today and for providing so much information. And I hope everybody has found this highly useful and beneficial, especially if you're just starting to launch. But even if you've been in business for a while, human resources, policies, and procedures are something that should be at the front of your headspace to some extent, just to make sure your business is successful. So we're here to help you. So if anybody who's in our Zoom room today would like to stick around for a second, we can have a further up chat. But for now, those of you who are watching on Facebook or watching this after the fact, thank you, and do connect with us if you have any questions, and we'll see you soon. So have yourselves a great day.